we are going to go ahead and get started. We have a very good presentation slated for you, and we want y'all to make as much noise as you want to, because we want you to understand and enjoy what we're about to share with you. So our first speaker today is going to be Mrs. Altamise Barnes of the Riley House. She's one of my go-to experts on history, and not just in Leon County, but in some of the surrounding counties as well.
I'm very happy to be here for this third series, and I received something a couple of weeks ago that resonated with me, and I wanted to share it today. And it says, if the Atlantic were to dry up, it would reveal a scattered pathway of human bones marking the various routes of the Middle Passage. But those who did survive multiplied and have contributed to the creation of a new human society in the Americas and the Caribbean. It is a testament to the vitality and fortitude of the Africans that 10 to 20 million lived through the heinous ordeal that many consider the greatest crime ever committed against a people in human history. I wanted to share that as a way of getting into my portion of today's lecture series, examining African American history in Florida and why. History is the only clue to what man can do based on what man has done. The history of African Americans in Florida is complex and a painful story, but an inspirational one as well. The African Americans were oppressed in the institution of slavery, fought against slavery, then fought against cruelties of Jim Crow and black codes that denied them human and civil rights, all while contributing to the society in which they were the victims. Here was a group of people speaking different languages, brought captive as slaves to a foreign land and oppressed for over 400 years. Yet, they forged many paths that are living testaments to their resilience, fortitude, hard work, struggle, and success in mounting this multiplicity of conditions under 5 flags. The 5 flags, the first Spanish period in Florida, 1513 to 1762, is the first recorded evidence of blacks in Florida. Africans find themselves in advantageous positions, most living in maroon societies as runaway slaves, choosing to live under Spanish authority and helping as well to repel British invasions. They are found being instrumental in the development of Florida under Spanish authority. During the second Spanish period in Florida, 1784 to 1821, is when planters in both Georgia and South Carolina view Florida as a prime real estate for the expansion of the plantation system. The fact that runaway slaves continued to live and thrive in Florida incensed this nearby American plantation society. So militias and eventually the United States military conducted raids on Florida in hope of seizing land and returning runaway slaves. Spanish authorities, seizing the advantage present in enslaved people, began to rely on black military contribution in order to maintain their control over Florida. And I reference here a recent publication by the Riley on the Proctors, who was one of the enslaved people that were used during the Spanish period as an interpreter for the Spanish government. The British occupation of Florida is 1763 to 1783, when Africans in British Florida existed in 2 primary factions: those living in plantation society in East Florida, the majority of them enslaved, and those living in maroon societies are cohabitating with Native Americans, primarily in West Florida. It is during this period that there is a transformation for some blacks in Florida into black Seminoles. The U.S. territory and state from 1821 to 1861. By this time, black maroon societies are destroyed, and there are very few black Seminoles in Florida. Most African descendants are concentrated in what is now Middle Florida, Leon, Jefferson, and Madison counties primarily, with plantation society. By the end of the period, 1861, all blacks are connected by and large to plantation society. Though President Lincoln ordered the freeing of slaves on January 1, 1863, 7 states resisted the order. Florida was one of those states. 1861 to 1865, Florida is a Confederate state. The majority of blacks are enslaved until the Emancipation Enforcement reading on May 20th. On this date in 1865, the 7 states in rebellion were ordered by President Lincoln to free all slaves immediately. General Ed McCook read this special enforcement order here in Tallahassee on May 20th, thus bringing an end by enforcement to slavery in Florida. However, though emancipated, blacks were by no means equal socially, politically, nor in the courts. Along came Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, bringing some gains, including opportunities for African Americans to serve in government, to openly and without danger pursue education, own property, and live and thrive in their own communities, but not for long, as things worsened during the era of Jim Crow black codes, where the right to vote, access public accommodations, earn equal or in some instances any pay, inflicted another period of enslavement of African Americans, bringing on the Civil Rights Movement. And so many of us are familiar with the Civil Rights Movement. We got through that. African Americans, along with some whites who worked along with us, were able to overcome and break down some of those barriers. And so here we are in the multicultural society, during which African Americans face still both struggles and triumphs. We need not go to other cities or to other states, but right here in our own city to discover and uncover evidentiary accounting of this history of which I speak. There are historic buildings right here in downtown Tallahassee and surrounding areas that were built by the hands of African Americans. There are a lot of people talk about the large oak trees, the crepe myrtles, the other beautiful foliage. A lot of those were planted and cultivated through the years by the hands of African Americans. Likewise, we can also look to many of the laws that brought about changes during Reconstruction that African Americans played a role in. As I come to a close, I do want to mention again that we have to look at history. When we look at history, it really tells us who we are and what man is. My co-presenter shared some minutes with me a little bit ago, and I just want to read that as a part of how important it is to go back and do research. These 2 excerpts are from local city minutes, May 14, 1860. And this was the Tallahassee City Council, which is now our City Commission. And this excerpt from the minutes read, "A petition from sundry citizens asking for a repeal of the law prohibiting slaves from living on lots by themselves was received and read by the council. After some consideration, it was moved and seconded that all such laws in relation to Negroes be repealed. The vote was taken. Ayes, none. Nays, 5. Let it stay in place. That was, a slave could not live off of the property. A last one, March 10, 1862, Tallahassee Council minutes. In the matter of substituting committal to jail, instead of whipping slaves arrested by the patrol, the following ordinance was unanimously adopted, and it read, "Be it ordained by the City Council that all slaves found in the streets of the city after 9 o'clock at night without a written pass shall be lodged in jail and shall only be released by the payment of all fees for such commitment by the master or owner of such slave. So, in closing, history tells us of these turbulent times. It also tells us of the people of color, our civil rights movement people, our abolitionists, and also some of goodwill whites, such as the Lewis family, who marched with us often in the civil rights movement to make a difference and bring about change. I profess that history provides a compass by which people can make choices between good and evil, love and hate, tolerance and forgiving, building up or tearing down. And now the main act.
If you don't have a timeline handout, raise your hand, and the young lady in the rear, Miss Page, will bring you one. I'm calling this the two civil rights movements in Tallahassee and Leon County in the 19th and 20th century, taken, as I said, from this book. I'm pleased to be here to celebrate Black History with all of you, the month, to talk about events and people in the past, especially those who played a very dynamic role in Tallahassee and Leon County's political history. Now, many people today may not know or remember that Tallahassee actually had two civil rights movements. So today I'd like to talk about both of these movements, but I will focus on the first one that took place after the Civil War to about 1890, which Ms. Barnes, thank you very much for this, has already laid us out a timeline. Then we're going to leap ahead and do a quick recap of the second movement in the 20th century. I'll divide the story into two parts as shown on your handout. Part one, Tallahassee's forgotten civil rights movement, and part two, the civil rights movement in the 20th century. Now I'm consolidating some 200 years of history here, so please forgive me if I leave out a few names and events along the way. And unless otherwise notified, all photos and maps are from the State of Florida archives. Now, before we talk about the civil rights movement, let's first get the setting and a little background about this area. This region that Ms. Barnes mentioned is called Middle Florida back in those days, just before and during the Civil War. So this is a map of the counties that made up Middle Florida in this period. It was an agricultural and cotton-growing region that stretched from Madison County in the east to Jackson County in the west. And Leon County, with the state capital of Tallahassee, of course, situated right in the center of this region. The red star that I drew just so you'd know where Tallahassee was. Before the war, Leon was the most prosperous county in Florida. Of course, that prosperity came from cotton produced on dozens of large plantations around the county, where also, of course, the crops were cultivated and harvested by the labor of black slaves. In fact, at the end of the war in 1865, the total population of Leon County was about 12,000, of which an estimated 9,000, or 2/3, were slaves. A small proportion of these slaves lived in Tallahassee, where the population was almost 2,000 people. Unlike the county, however, the town was predominantly white, about 3/4 white. And in keeping with local and state laws, of course, the lives of the slaves and free blacks were severely restricted in town and around the county. And I will sort of recap a little bit of what Ms. Barnes has said here. For example, you know it was illegal to educate black slaves. Slaves could not move freely around the town or the county or anywhere else without a permit from the owner. Well, if they were picked up, they were in trouble. nor could they hire out their services without a permit from the owner. Now, the owner could hire them out, but they could not hire themselves out. And during the war, again, as Ms. Barnes says, the Tallahassee Council enacted a few more laws making it illegal for slaves to live on a lot in town alone. They had to be supervised by a white person. They could not operate a business, for example, a dining hall, a barbershop, blacksmith, unless a white person was present on the premises. And violators could be harshly punished, whipped, or put in jail, or worse. In which case, interestingly, they would not be released, as she says, until the white owner paid the fine, usually $10 per man or woman, but it was a small incentive for owners to control their slaves. So this is a setting in about April 1865 when our story begins. It's the spring of 1865. The Civil War has ended. The South, the Confederacy, is defeated. And in May, Union troops arrive in Tallahassee, where they accepted the surrender of Florida, raised the Stars and Stripes over the state capitol, and emancipated all the slaves in Leon County. So consequently, an estimated 9,000 black slaves suddenly are free. In the following days, the Union commander declared martial law in town, set up Army headquarters in downtown Tallahassee, arrested the acting governor, disbanded legislature and the city government, and shut down the local newspaper. Now, in addition to the white regiments with the Union Army, it included 2 units of United States colored troops, which consisted of former slaves and free blacks. The presence of these black men moving freely around Tallahassee made the white folks kind of uneasy. So to calm their fears, the commander stationed these troops at Fort Ward, or St. Mark's. In the aftermath of the war and emancipation, all former Confederate states, including Florida, were required to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. At the same time, however, Congress also disenfranchised white former Confederate soldiers until they swore an ironclad oath of allegiance to the United States, which many did, of course, to gain their voting rights. In November 1865, the Union commander called for a convention at the Capitol where delegates would revise the state constitution so that Congress could readmit Florida to the Union. Accordingly, Florida's eligible voters, whites only, elected a group of delegates, all white, former Confederates, many former slave owners, who wrote the Constitution of 1865. Well, the new document included the 13th Amendment and guaranteed the state would protect the personal and property rights of the freedmen, as the former slaves now were called. But the new laws, black codes, also severely restricted all aspects of the freedmen's lives, and again ensured that violators would be punished. Afterwards, the document was sent to Congress for approval. Florida then elected a new governor, a white, ex-Confederate, and former slaveholder from Quincy. Meanwhile, the Union commander reinstated the Tallahassee City Council, and in December 1865, the council repealed all city ordinances relating to Negroes and Negro slavery. Thus, in 1865, the era of slavery in Tallahassee, Leon County came officially to an end. Let's take a quick look at the economic situation at the end of the war. The county was in an economic depression. White residents were experiencing hard times. Confederate money was worthless. White businesses and formerly wealthy planters were bankrupted. Emancipation alone had cost them millions of dollars in slave property, but it also left them without a labor force to work the fields. and the crops were already in the ground. The situation was far worse for the former slaves. They were free, but that freedom came at a high price. For now they found themselves homeless, landless, and jobless. They were uneducated. Most could not even read or write his name. And few comprehended the meaning of freedom or what it entailed. As slaves, they'd never been required to provide for themselves or family all by themselves. Okay, so furthermore, they were free, but they still were not citizens. They couldn't vote or run for office, so they had no voice in the government. Now homeless, many simply took to the roads looking for work or a handout, or followed the camps of those rare characters that they had never seen before, the black Union soldiers, a situation the Union commander denounced severely. Meanwhile, summer crops are in the ground, and without attention, they're going to fail, which could result in famine for everyone, black and white. So the Union commander ordered the freedmen to return to the land of their former masters and contract to work as tenant farmers and sharecroppers. Now, neither white planters nor the freedmen liked this arrangement, but most complied, and famine was averted. Well, soon after the war, white and black federal agents from the North, all Republican, remember, were sent or came on their own to Florida and to Tallahassee to assist the former slaves to make the transition to freedom. You've heard of the Freedmen's Bureau, I'm sure. They also were planning to oust any remaining Confederates and Democrats. They were going to reorganize, take over the government, and only Republicans need apply. However, they knew that sooner or later the freedmen would have the right to vote. And since freedmen greatly outnumbered the whites, the Republicans wanted that vote. At first, the Republicans promised full equality and 40 acres and a mule to any freedman who would join the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party that had set them free. On the other hand, they said the Democrats would take away their freedom and return them all to slavery, which probably was true. So Leon's freedmen, inexperienced in political games, eagerly joined the Republicans. By the way, Southern whites called these newcomers from the North carpetbaggers, a reference to their luggage that was made out of carpet. Forever after, Southerners attached that expression, carpetbagger, to unscrupulous men who exploited a bad situation. Now, by the time the Republican agents arrived, another group of men had already come to the aid of the Leon's former slaves. Local black ministers, themselves newly emancipated, were already helping the freedmen adjust to their changed circumstances. Among the earliest and most prominent of these church leaders and activists, in essence the vanguard of a future civil rights movement, was James Page, born a slave in Virginia in 1808. By the 1850s, he lived on his master's plantation at Bel Air, about 5 miles south of Tallahassee. He was an ordained Baptist minister, and at Bel Air established Bethel Baptist Church, which is believed to have been the first regularly organized all-black Baptist church in Florida. After emancipation, Page moved his church to Tallahassee. Robert Meacham, born in Gadsden County in 1835, the son of his white master, who, contrary to state law, had provided him with an education. Once free, Meacham moved to Tallahassee, where he founded the African American Episcopal Church, which by the end of 1865 had 116 members. Like other black ministers, Page and Meacham quickly joined the Republican Party. The two men got along well together, too. For example, on February 20th, 1866, just 150 years ago, 54 years ago, last Thursday, Page helped Meacham lay the cornerstone for Tallahassee's first AME church building on Duval Street. However, only 2 days later, February 22nd was that Saturday, this harmonious relationship was interrupted when Reverend Charles H. Pierce, also an AME minister, arrived in Tallahassee. Reverend Pierce, also the son of a white man, had been born free and generally was well educated. Pierce had been sent from the north to head the AME church in Tallahassee. He was a devout Republican, of course, and a strong advocate of equal rights for the freedmen. According to Pierce, a minister could not do his whole duty unless he also looked out for the political interests of his congregation. Well, Pierce quickly took over the thriving AME church in Tallahassee and sent Meacham to Jefferson County, two acts that kind of bred a little ill will between these two men. They became competitors. Still another rival was William G. Stewart, a former slave from Georgia, self-educated, also an AME minister and a devout Republican. In 1866, Stewart was appointed cashier of the local Freedmen's Bank, which in those days was located in the old Union Bank at Adams and Park Avenue, and today, of course, houses a museum on Appalachia Parkway. Now, these are only a few of the many black church leaders at the forefront of this first civil rights movement. As ministers, their primary mission was to tend to the soul and the general welfare of the freedmen. However, along with their sermons, they preached Republican ideals of political equality, economic equality for all colored people. Consequently, their churches served not only as houses of worship, but also as centers of political activity, something that the white residents kind of frowned upon. The Republican agents and ministers soon were joined by a large number of veterans of the USCT, all loyal to the Union and to the Republican Party. Like other freedmen, many of these veterans had little or no education, but many had an innate intelligence, were quick learners, forceful speakers, and proved to be natural leaders. Their independence and their self-confidence greatly inspired Leon's freedmen. One of these veterans was John Wallace, born in 1832 in North Carolina. He was self-educated, and in 1866 was hired to teach colored children on a plantation here in Leon County, William Bloxam's plantation, if that means anything to you. Wallace was a resolute Republican and a master politician who developed a large following among the freedmen, the white Republicans, and even the white Democrats. I wanted to point out that we have some other names here. There are many more, but you don't have time for all of them. But I want you to look at William Henry Ford and see if that last name is going to mean anything to you in a little bit here. However, by 1867, just 2 years after the war, the fact was that white Floridians in both parties, Northern Republicans, Southern Democrats, controlled the government, economics, and society. And the fact is that most had little regard for the freedmen, whom they deemed as little more than slaves. Therefore, life in Tallahassee quickly returned to the same old pattern that had existed before the war. Finally, the radical Republicans in the U.S. Congress had had enough. They were determined to destroy their old Southern foes. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, which granted qualified black males over the age of 21 the right to vote and run for office. Well, the acts required Florida, of course, to hold another convention to update that Constitution one more time. The Union commander set the election for November 1867, and the first step was to elect the delegates to do the work. Now, here's how this worked. The Union Army took a state census of all residents, black and white. And the blacks are no longer counted as 3/5 of a person. Now they're counted as a whole person. The Army then drew up voting districts based on population, allotted delegates to each district, and just for your information, Leon and Wakulla County, both predominantly black, comprised District 6 and was allotted 6 delegates. Meanwhile, the Army assigned each district, each voting district, 3 voter registrars, 2 white and 1 black male. Now let me note here that even though I've had some dissension from knowledgeable people, from all evidence I've found, and Claude Kennison has helped me on this one, Reverend James Page was one of the 3 registers in District 6, which rightfully makes James Page the first black public official in Leon County. Well, for the first time, the election is open to white and black voters and candidates. And to the shock of the white Democrats, Republican freedmen tossed their hats into the ring. In essence, inaugurating this first civil rights movement in Tallahassee and Leon County. Consequently, by all measures, the campaign and election of November 1867 were historic. The black candidates, totally inexperienced in politics, held rallies all over the district, in town, out in the bush arbors, at the plantations, whatever, where they railed against their own Republican opponents, black and white, and actually held public debates with white conservative Democrats, former Confederates and slave owners, elected officials, powerful judges, and churchmen. After one such debate, a black candidate noted that only 2 years earlier, any black man who had argued with a white man would have been flogged or worse. Yet today, he said, thanks to the Republican Party, here we are, free black men running for public office. And keep in mind, they still had not been granted citizenship. The rallies drew raucous crowds of both races, even women and children. And at each event, the Republicans urged the eligible black males in the audience to register to vote. And they did. Meanwhile, many white voters had refused to take the ironclad oath and couldn't vote. And at the same time, others were disgruntled over Reconstruction and wouldn't vote. So by election day, black voters outnumbered whites 3-1. So the outcome of the election was a foregone conclusion. Of the 6 delegates elected in District 6, all are Republicans, and 5 of the 6 are black. Note, names of the 5 black delegates are in bold italics, in case I didn't say that. In January 1868, the delegates met at the Capitol downtown. The convention was dominated by Republicans of both races, but they had split into 2 factions, and each side was fighting for control of the convention. It turned into such a rowdy affair, and events became so violent that they had to call the Union commander all the way from Atlanta to restore order at the Capitol. Finally, then, after weeks of haggling, the delegates produced a new constitution that, among other things, somewhat expanded the freedmen's rights and privileges, that many black Republicans complained didn't go far enough, while ordinary freedmen were disappointed they didn't get their 40 acres and a mule. Of course, the Democrats deplored this new document. They dubbed it the carpetbagger Constitution. But Congress did approve it, and Florida was readmitted to the Union. In June 1868, Florida elected its first Republican governor, a white man from Jacksonville with northern roots. And for the first time, Leon County elected a slate of all black Republicans to the state legislature. The following month, by the way, July 1868, the states ratified the 14th Amendment, and the former slaves became full citizens of the United States. Meanwhile, Florida's new governor appointed a number of Leon's black men to public offices in the county government. Well, now, once the freedmen had been elected to the Constitutional Convention, had been elected to the state legislature, had been appointed to Leon County offices, it was only a matter of time before they set their sights on the Tallahassee City Council. So in December 1869, the first group of black Republicans ran for city offices. But now keep in mind, unlike the county, Tallahassee is predominantly white, and white voters outnumber blacks. So in 1869, these first candidates were soundly defeated, but they didn't give up. The next year, December 1870, they tried a second time, and by that time, the 15th Amendment had been ratified, which enfranchised all qualified black males over the age of 21. Well, in the city election, black candidates doubled their votes, but again, they were defeated. However, the third time proved to be the charm. In 1871, the Republican slate included 5 black candidates, and while the number of black voters had increased, many whites still couldn't vote or refused to register. So, no surprise, the Republicans swept the field, and for the first time, 5 black men were elected to the Tallahassee City Council. And Jonathan Gibbs, whose name will be familiar to a lot of you, who is elected to our first group on the City Council, is also the first African American in the Florida Cabinet, where he was appointed as Secretary of State by Governor Reed, and he was the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And he did wonders for Tallahassee's fire department, by the way, our volunteer fire department. These early successes confirmed that under Republican Reconstruction, Leon's black citizens were making great strides in their quest for equal rights. And as we'll see, for the next 2 decades, they continued to be appointed or elected to public offices at almost every level of government. However, their progress was disrupted by some events. By 1872, all across the country, Americans had tired of paying for and hearing about Reconstruction in the South. Meanwhile, Floridians and both parties accused Mr. Reed, Governor Reed, and his Republican administration of corruption. They said the high taxes and land giveaways were bankrupting the state. They wanted reforms. At the same time, many black Republicans were growing disenchanted with their party. Their economic condition had not improved, and white Republican bosses blocked them from rising any higher in the party or in state government. And some blacks even began siding with the Democrats. Of course, in truth, neither white Democrats or white Republicans wanted black officials in state government. They said it would give the state a bad image. But white Republicans were aware of one simple fact: without black votes, the party faced defeat. At any rate, in the legislative session of 1875, black Republicans and white Democrats allied in a common cause to demand reform in state government. And according to the press, this coalition of black and white legislators sounded the death knell to Reconstruction and Republican rule in Florida. Then, in that infamous election of 1876, Florida elected a Democratic governor, and northern and southern whites of both parties, as you know, colluded to put a Republican president in the White House, one who vowed he would end Reconstruction. And once he took office, he did. With Florida Republicans no longer in power, they fled the state. Within a few short years, white Democrats were back in control of government at most levels. By that time, the economic recession was ending, and while Leon's whites were beginning to prosper, the conditions for black citizens, the freedmen, grew steadily worse. Some were already running small shops, a few owned land, but most were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, or worked as field hands or domestic servants, or as menial labor, earning 25 to 75 cents a day. Abandoned by the Republican Party, Leon's freedmen were losing hope. They stopped registering and they stopped voting. And desperate for a better life, many left the county in search of jobs in other parts of the state. The railroads were being built, for example, and in the free territories and states in the West. This black exodus left Leon's white residents and plantation owners desperate for servants and field hands, but that's another story. Meanwhile, a new generation of white Democrats were taking over. These were the sons of the old Confederates who openly supported white supremacy and were determined to get rid of any remaining black Republicans in the government. So in 1885, the Democrats called another convention, the third since the Civil War, and rewrote the Constitution of 1868, the old carpetbagger Constitution. There were 7 blacks at that constitutional convention. 4 of them were from Leon County. The white Democrats then took back control of government at all levels, renewed the regulations on black citizens, instituted the poll tax, and soon thereafter closed all Democratic primaries to the black voter. In effect, the Constitution of 1885 marks the end of the first civil rights movement in Tallahassee and Leon County and ushers in the era of Jim Crow. By 1891, there are no black public officials in Tallahassee or Leon County at any level. Almost 100 years would pass before another would hold any public office in the city or the county. But those who had served left behind a legacy. Now we're going to take a look at this legacy. What I want you to see is the sheer number of black public officials in Leon County during this period. These are appointed officials, and this is just page 1. Reconstruction, a Republican governor, and you see all these names. The office is over there on the left. Okay, page 2. Again, look at the number of black public officials in Leon County. And then I've marked Mr. John W. Mitchell's name in red over here because, in essence, he was the last black appointed in Leon County government of any level until 1975, when Dr. Doris Alston was appointed to the school board. Now let's look at black legislators, and again we're going to have 2 pages. Page 1, there are 4 from Leon County, and if you notice, throughout this entire period, they're all black with 1 or 2 exceptions. Okay? Page 2. Second page is after Reconstruction. Look what happens to the number of black legislators after the Constitution of 1885. By the way, John Wallace and John Proctor were elected to the House and the Senate at various times. Okay, now this next picture, I just like these pictures. Neighbors, kinsmen, and prominent public officials. Mr. John Elias Proctor on the front porch of his home when he was about 100 years old. Charles Rollins, living in that same period across the street from Mr. Proctor. Did Dr. Mason make it today? Would you stand up? Living history here. Stand up, Dr. Mason. A descendant, direct descendant of these 2 men. And someday he'll be giving talks about those connections, and watch for it is all I can say. Thank you. The next chart shows men elected to the Tallahassee City Council. And again, we're going to have 2 pages, 1871 to 1890. The first page, again, shows councilmen elected during Reconstruction, 1871 to 1878. And please notice, again, I have a name in red, Samuel C. Watkins, 1876. That year, the mayor of Tallahassee, the white mayor, had gone to the Republican convention in Philadelphia, where they nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. And while he was out of town, as president of the city council, Samuel C. Watkins became the acting mayor for his time out of town, thereby making Mr. Watkins the first black mayor in Tallahassee, 140 years ago. Second page is from 1880 to 1890. Again, look what happens to the number of black city councilmen after the Constitution. And note that Alfred Cobb was the last African American on the city council until 1971. He had served 7 terms, by the way. By the end of the 19th century, except for being free, Tallahassee and Leon's black citizens had lost most of the gains they had made after the Civil War. And under the new laws, they were subjected to discrimination and segregation and to worsening economic conditions, a situation that for most would continue well into the future. Now let's take a very quick look at events in the 20th century that led to the second civil rights movement. And I'm going to be condensing 50 years here into 3 statements. 1, during this period, African Americans pursued education and entered professions and careers and businesses that led to a prosperous, growing black middle class with rising expectations and a demand for full equality. 2, they served in 3 wars: Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. They were exposed to a different world of people and experiences, many of which were very liberating. Number 3, during the Great Depression, many African Americans liked what FDR said and did and began to leave the Republican Party and join Roosevelt's Democrats. But in the South, the people still can't vote for him. So what changed? Let's take a quick look here at events, a closer look at events in 1944. Some of you might even have been alive in that year. It's the middle of World War II. Roosevelt's running for his 4th term, and miraculously, that year, the Supreme Court ruled that Southern Democrats must open their primaries to black voters. Well, that was good news in Leon County, 2/3 white, population 40,000, with 18 black registered Democrats in the county, and 9 of those lived in the city, all eager to vote for Roosevelt. But despite the Supreme Court's ruling, Leon's white election supervisors hoped to prevent blacks from voting, black Democrats from voting. And I simply must tell this story about one Leon County voter, Miss Carrie Bentley. And before again, let me give you a little background here. When I began doing this research in 1988, how many years ago was that? Mrs. Barnes arranged for me to interview Miss Patsy Payne, the sister of Carrie Bentley. This is what she told me, as verified by reports in the Tallahassee Democrat. On Election Day 1944, the polls opened as usual at 7 a.m., and all remained calm around the county, except at the Leon Courthouse. Shortly after 7 a.m., Miss Carrie Bentley, 24-year-old black teacher at Old Lincoln School, arrived at the courthouse and got in the line of voters. Well, white reaction was immediate. Angry poll workers tried to get her to leave. Well, Bentley refused to be intimidated. She refused to leave, and she threatened to get a lawyer. Election officials said they weren't trying to prevent her from voting, but that they had to wait until they got a legal ruling on her status, whatever that means. The officials called in the school superintendent, who threatened Bentley's job if she didn't leave the polls. Meanwhile, Bentley's boss, another name that will be familiar to many of you, Mr. Gilbert Porter, principal at Old Lincoln, fearing she'd lose her job, came to the courthouse and persuaded her to go on to the classroom. Okay, Bentley relented and went on to Lincoln, but she was determined to vote. According to Ms. Payne, at the end of the day, Carrie returned to the courthouse, and at 6:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the polls closed, she was allowed to cast her ballot. And excuse me, I get passionate at that point. But in the aftermath of the election, the school board threatened they'd fire any black teacher who ever tried to vote again in Tallahassee. Mrs. Payne said this affair was one of several, of course, that helped arouse black residents to get more involved in local politics. And they did. And so we come to the dream fulfilled. Now, many of you remember this era, or you've read about it, so I'm just going to hit a few high points here. By 1952, the Black Ministerial Alliance and Inter-Civic Council had been formed, and in 1952, they persuaded the Tallahassee Police Department to hire the first African-American patrolman in the 20th century. There had been no African-Americans in the Tallahassee Police Department since 1897. The first three, of course, were Clarence Mitchell, Fred Douglass Lee, and Freddie Golden. 1956. Two FAMU co-eds, and I don't have to say their names, but I will. Wilhelmina Jakes and Carrie Patterson boarded a city bus, had the audacity to sit down by a white woman, and when told to move, refused to. So, of course, they were arrested, and we launched the Tallahassee bus boycott, which marks the beginning of the second civil rights movement in Tallahassee. Led by the ministers and the Inter-Civic Council, this boycott produced a whole new generation of black leaders. And this time, instead of them being freedmen, recently enslaved, they were educated, they were prosperous, and they were prominent in the community. I don't have time to name many. Let me mention Reverend David Brooks, Dan and Cornelia Steele, and of course, Reverend Mitz Collins, Edwin Norwood, and Reverend C.K. Steele. All of you are familiar with those names too. And they took action to end this ridiculous situation of racial segregation and discrimination in Tallahassee. In February 1957, the bus boycott is still sort of going on here. It hasn't been resolved. For the first time in 81 years, a black pastor ran for an open seat on the Tallahassee City Commission. That man, of course, was Reverend King Solomon DuPont, pastor of the Fountain Chapel AME Church and vice president of the Inter-Civic Council. Well, old-time white conservatives did their best to interrupt his campaign. But DuPont and his supporters were not deterred. He didn't win the election, but he did receive 25% of the vote. And he set the stage for black candidates to come. So we come to the 1960s. Here's all I'm going to say about that. This was a very tumultuous, revolutionary decade. Again, many of you recall those events, and others will have read about them. Meanwhile, two more black candidates ran for seats on the City Commission. Sam Howell, some of you will remember Mr. Howell, some of you will remember his wife, Ms. Aquilina Howell. Professor Edwin Norwood. By the way, Norwood had already been the first African American in the 20th century to be hired in the governor's office. I think it was Hayden Burns, under Hayden Burns. Norwood faced 5 white opponents. Again, he didn't win, but he was the first black candidate to reach a runoff. So we come to 1970. Again, another chaotic year. I know, I was at Rickards High School, I remember. Public facilities, Leon County schools were being desegregated, and civil rights activists were taking to the streets to protest the closing of Old Lincoln School, the FAMU Law School, and the FAMU Hospital. And they were protesting the city's plan to raze old dilapidated buildings in Frenchtown and build public housing in its place. The protesters also demanded the city and county to hire more black public employees. Meanwhile, Tallahassee was growing. By that time, it was 70,000 people that lived here. And it included an influx of white liberal newcomers who had already been around the country protesting on their own, that joined with black protesters to demand change. So we come to the historic city election in 1971. There was one open seat in Group 1 and in Group 2. Two young black men announced for Group 1, Raleigh Jugger, some of you will know his name, and Richard Allen, who just happens to have the same name as the man who founded the AME Church back in 1816. And 4 white men announced for Group 2. But at the last minute, James R. Ford, the black assistant principal at Leon High School, was persuaded to enter the race in Group 2. I had the pleasure of interviewing former Mayor Ford in his later years, and he said at the time he just felt he had little hope of winning and very little money, but to his surprise, he quickly gained the approval of the city at large and won the endorsement of the Tallahassee Democrat. In the end, the seat in Group 1 went to a white man. But in Group 2, Ford won 54% of the vote. He's the first African American since 1890, 81 years, to hold any public office in Tallahassee and Leon County. Now, no more talk. We're going to look at some pictures and some charts. And I'll make a few remarks, and if you have, and please forgive me, I'm going to show you charts of people's names. If I've forgotten somebody or overlooked somebody, please forgive me. First, black female elected to the city commission. Come on, stand up, Dot. Another moment of living history. We've got them all over the place here, haven't we? And then the city commission from 1984 to 2018. All righty, these faces are familiar to you too. Miss Anita Favors Thompson, Walt McNeil, and Cassandra Jackson. Okay. A chart of Leon County Board of Commissioners. Ms. Doris Malloy, Akin Akinyemi, and Gwen Marshall. And yes, another moment of living history. Okay, we come to Leon County School Board. Dr. Alston, who was appointed in 1975. Leon County judges and the Florida State Legislature. And finally, another familiar face, Mr. Al Lawson. He's got so many titles we don't know quite what to call him. Distinguished as the first African American elected to the House of Representatives since 1886. The third to be elected to both the House and the Senate. Remember that Proctor and Wallace had been elected in the 19th century to both houses. The first ever to be elected to the U.S. Congress, and the first ever to serve in the Florida House, Florida Senate, and the United States Congress. And somewhere I had some really profound closing remarks, but I guess I left them off somewhere along the way. I just wanted to say, let's salute these brave black and white public servants. And that was long, and I apologize. Thank you for your attention.
Farewell. We want to thank you for your support of this series. We committed to doing 3 of these this year. We'll look at doing more in the future. Let's give Dr. May another round of applause.